Hello, welcome to Podfic Galore. I'm your horrible online reader, Grossgaisteiger. I read out loud fanfictions for you busy bees, free of charge and no strings attached. Today I will continue reading the Silmarillion/Lord of the Rings fic by Bloodwing Blackbird from Archive of Our Own called And Now Each Night I Count the Stars. I hope you can at least try to enjoy my voice, and I will try my best for you with the equipment available to me. Note, this fic is rated explicit. On with the show. And now each night I count the stars. Chapter 8. Halbarad had neither hoped for nor expected a sudden change in his companion after these confessions, which was just as well, for he would have been destined for disappointment. And yet, it was still a rare thing to hear Maklor speak of himself, though from time to time a morsel of tantalizing history would drop from his lips. Halbarad was neither nosy nor an impatient man, and was content to let Maklor reveal as much or as little of himself as he wished. He thought that perhaps he was not ready to hear all the truths of his companion in any case. At times, Maklor seemed to walk in a world that was slightly to the left and millennia removed from the one Halbarad inhabited. He would have despaired at the distance if Maklor had not reached back across it with incessant and sometimes intrusive questions. His family history, or as much as he knew of it, was unearthed and examined. His travels, his preferences, his dreams, all were laid bare to Maklor's inquisitive eyes, and Halbarad was surprised to find that he didn't mind. That sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he would find himself trying to think of stories that he hadn't yet told. Perhaps Maklor could not quite return these truths with his own, but he sang for Halbarad, wrapped him up tight in his songs and stories, and one night Halbarad was startled to find himself standing there, tall and plain, in Maklor's verses, homely bold to Maklor's swooping bird. He had knocked the harp from Maklor's hand in his haste to kiss him, as he had been able to taste the words on his lips, a declaration that could only be made in song, and maybe it meant something that Maklor had let the harp fall, chiming, beside them. In this way, they drew closer in the steps of their dance, cautious and reckless at once, close enough that Halbarad could almost forget the distance that would always keep their kindreds asunder. At night, though, sometimes the gulf of time, of disparity, would make itself known, and Halbarad would wake to find Maklor standing above him, holding a conversation in his ancient lisping tongue with someone that Halbarad could not see. Perhaps it would have made him afraid, for it seemed true that something haunted Maklor, but he sometimes smiled as he spoke, and Halbarad would lie awake and watch him until the shimmering whispers shepherded him back to sleep. Elves, it was said, walked in the world with their memories near and tangible, and as long as the haunts spoke kindly to Maklor, then Halbarad would not challenge them. The greatest change, perhaps, was this. He laughed sometimes, and not only in bitterness as they had when they first met. The cause was hard to predict. It might be a turtle slipping into a pond, a sudden dawn after the long dark, or Halbarad's mustaches against his neck when they embraced. It was startling, a wonderful warm sound that made Halbarad's heart leap. He collected each rare laugh and hoarded them all close to his skin as if he were preparing for winter. Together they patrolled the edges of the Shire, walking the banks of Baranduin from the ruined Andominos to the foothills of the Blue Mountains, and then passing through the hills to the west of the Shire to begin the circuit again. As they went, they met with many of Halbarad's folk, for Aragorn had doubled the watch on the Shire before departing on his southward journey. They again met with Almidon and Aglaril at the ford, and with Kirion at Lake Evendim, and with Haleth, where the road passed over the Tower Hills. As always, gossip spread quickly among the rangers, defying their roaming, and none seemed surprised to find Maklor traveling with him. Each post gave its reports to Halbarad, as they would have to Aragorn, and he tried to seem as if the responsibility did not terrify him. He listened to all that they had to say, and gave such encouragement as he could, though it felt forced and inept. The remnants of the Dunedain were, by necessity, a suspicious and isolated people, for the enemy haunted them still, and yet they accepted Maklor easily, perhaps recognizing in him, as Halbarad did, something of their own wariness and disposition. In his turn, he He seemed to understand the things that they needed to hear, and Halbarad remembered with something like a surprise that he had been a leader among his own people in the wars that the elves fought so long ago that they belonged more in the realm of myth than in the world in which Halbarad lived. Perhaps it did not feel so long ago for him, for he listened to Haleth talk to Maklor and heard the heavy bitterness in her voice as she told Maklor how orcs had come in force from Angmar and burned the settlement of their folk near ruined Fornost, how she and her sisters had come too late to help them. Maklor did not reassure her that it was not her fault. He did not say that she could not have done differently as Halbarad might have done. Instead, he only said, "You live still. You have it in your power to make the next time different." They traveled with her to Fornost, where the remnants of her folk had fortified the ruins as much as they were able, and there they awaited the next attack. It came the following night, while Halbarad kept watch with Maklor, on a night of no moon and few stars. Clouds had come from the sea, and the very air smelled of lightning. With Haleth and her sisters, Meleth and Hiril, there were a few strong fighters with the group. Most of them were either too old or too young. The children had slept in the ruin of a granary, the old folk around them with such weapons as they could still use. The orcs came from the east, with no pretense of stealth, for they thought their prey already weakened. Halbarad could not fathom their intent, for the folk of the settlement had had little enough to take already, and now they had less. Whatever their reason, their confidence was their undoing, for as they came, Halbarad and Maklor left the sisters hidden before the granary and sneaked away to the north and to the south, picking their way over the tumbled stones of the long-ruined kingdom to come upon the raiders from behind. There were not many of them, a troop of perhaps 50 orc, but enough that they had taken the settlement unawares, or had they less fighting folk to defend them, things might have gone ill. Even so, it was no easy victory, for the rear guard was attentive, and Halbarad was quiet, and not as silent as an elf. Whether they caught his scent, or heard a snap of a twig, the shift of a stone beneath his boot, it did not matter, for the alarm was raised, and his ambush discovered. Still, he loosed many arrows at them before he was overwhelmed. One of his foes clubbed him, striking his left arm, and he stumbled to his knees, the bow falling from nervous fingers. He had his sword out in the space between one breath and another, and buried it in the guts of the orc before he could strike again. To his right, he could hear the shouts of the attackers and the screams of the children. If he had done no more than ensure that the whole force did not fall on the survivors all at once, then perhaps that was good enough. He knew at least that those he shot would not rise again, for Halbarad, son of Halbaran, did not miss. He wrenched his sword free and readied himself for the next attack when a cry split the night and the orcs around him quailed. Some threw down their weapons and covered their ears. More would have fled, but their own folk shot arrows at them and they fell. More were cut down as Maklor sighted through them as easily as they were stalks of wheat. He moved like a flame, leaping in the darkness, his glaive flashing as the lightning approached, and though the echoes of his shout had faded into the rumble of coming thunder, Halbarad thought that he could still hear the song. The sight felt familiar somehow, like something he had seen in a dream, and though he knew he would not die that night, he thought that when he did, he would see Maklor dancing toward him this way, like a flame made flesh, lovely and fell. Halbarad shouted with joy as he cut his way to Maklor and then turned to aid his friends. Pitting the remnant of the orcs between themselves and the defenders, they closed on them until the last of the attackers were driven off or slain. Halbarad laughed then, for his blood was still high, and he embraced his people, his friends. This was not the last fight they would have, for the life they had was one that made such things common, that on this night they all lived, and though many were injured, all would heal. Last, he turned to Maklor and pulled him close, not caring who might see. "You're wounded," he said to Halbarad, standing back, careful of his left arm. "It's nothing," he said, though, in truth, it was beginning to ache ferociously, and his sleeve was soaked with blood. He sniffed the air. "The storm will be on us soon. We should take shelter." They spent the night in the ruins of the granary, crowded with the rangers and their folk. None slept well, for the roof leaked. They tended to the wounded as well as they could in the dark, washing the wounds with fresh rainwater and binding them with the cleanest cloth they could find. In the morning, they took stock of their hurts and found themselves fortunate. One of the old women went out with some children to seek athelas, which still grew around the place. Most of their wounds were simple bruises and surface cuts, which would heal as long as they were tended. Halbardat's shoulder proved to be worse harm than any had taken, for the club had struck him had been studded with iron nails, one of which had torn deep into the muscle. Halbardat had bitten hard on a piece of leather to stop himself from crying out while it was cleaned. The old woman, Anariel, had not been over gentle, and his stomach still felt unsettled and hollow from the pain. She had sent Michael away, for he had started toward Halbardat every time he made a sound, a frightening expression on his face. Anariel had finally declared that she could not work with him plaguing her, and sent him to search the battlefield for anything of use while she finished. "Thank you, Anariel," Halbardat said, and gritted his teeth as she pressed a poultice of Atlas to the wound. "'Tis the least I can do," she said, patting his good shoulder and glancing up as a shadow passed across the light. "Well, what have you found?" she said. "The orcs have taken their dead, but they left these." He stood in the doorway, looking even more ominous than usual, but when she motioned him to move over, he moved so swiftly it was hard for Halbardat to track the motion. He set the bow and some recovered arrows beside Halbardat. "I think it will be some time before you can use them again." Maglar watched as the old woman bound the clean cloth around the wound. "No, no," muttered Anariel, a smile tugging at her lips. "I'm done. There's no need to stare like you're plotting my death. It should not fester as long as you keep it clean." She turned to Maglar and patted the back of his hand. "You should heal well." "Have you been frightening these fine folk, Blackbird?" Halbardat asked when she had gone to tend someone else, squinting at Maglar, relieved to see that he appeared to be unscathed apart from a purpling bruise along his jaw. "If that was my aim, I seem to have failed. They sent me away like I was a troublesome child." He glanced at the girl of perhaps 9 who had been helping Anariel and corrected himself. "They sent me away like I was of less use than a child." He frowned. "They were right. I have little patience and no skill at healing." He leaned close and put a hand over Halbardat's heart. "I was afraid, Halbardat. There was nothing I could do." "Well, here's something." Anariel returned and passed Maglar a mug filled with broth before speaking to Halbardat. "Try that and see if it settles your stomach a mite." Maglar helped him to sit, a task which seemed distinctly more difficult than it should have, and then watched as he sipped at the broth. "Better?" "Oh, aye," Halbardat said, for Anariel was right. It did help. Maglar sat with him until the mug was empty, and when he finally allowed Halbardat to stand, Halbardat was pleased that his legs shook only a little, for his bladder was full and he was hungry. "Let's go outside." Back in the clean-smelling air, he leaned on Maglar's shoulder for a moment and looked out on the ruins, pleased enough to still be breathing until he laid his hand on his belt. "Have you taken my knife?" They travelled next to Bree to leave messages for Gandalf and Aragorn. They were lucky to have arrived on a market day, maybe one of the last of the harvest season. Halbardat divided their few coins between them, and they went among the merchants to see what they could find. As Anariel had promised, Halbardat's shoulder was healing well, though it still pained him. Maglar had fretted and had tried to insist that Halbardat travel to Rivendell for healing. Whether he was at last convinced of the skills of the Dunedain, or perhaps simply wary of Halbardat's stubbornness, he had finally left the argument behind. He had insisted, however, that Halbardat bear nothing with his left arm, and so he took the bulk of Halbardat's gear and added to his own pack. The gesture seemed to please him, so Halbardat permitted it, at least for a bit longer. They bought a hunk of hard cheese and some small dried fish, some leather with which to repair their boots, and while Maglar was haggling with a wine merchant, a bit of fine red ribbon that Halbardat thought Maglar would find fair. When he found Maglar again, he had instead spent the last of their coin on a small bag of apricots, brought all the way from Far Harad. Halbardat shook his head. "Could you not find something less dear? Look, they have apples still." Maglar looked affronted and clutched the bag close. "These are a gift." Halbardat's ears warmed. "Aw, Blackbird." Maglar laughed, seeing his mistake. "Not for you. These I'll bring to the Lord of the Rivendell when midwinter comes." He smiled at Halvard then. But if you wish, I'll play for a bit. Maybe I can earn enough for a skin of wine and a loaf of bread. He did so, and they camped in a field outside of the village, and Maklar sang while Halvard braided the red ribbon into his hair. When he finished, the moon was very high and bright enough to cast their shadows on the ground. What do you call that song? I call it The Bull and the Bird. He pulled the oilcloth into his lap, carefully wrapping the harp. He turned his head to glance back. Do you like it? It is for you. Sure you needn't ask, Halvard said, his braiding now finished, but he did not pull his hands away. Though maybe I should ask if you want me to keep touching you like this. He let his hand stray down Maklar's neck to his shoulders. Maklar shifted, set the harp gently aside, then to lean back against Halvard, pressing himself close. You are the one who is cautious. It was true. They had shared kisses, had slept in each other's arms, and Halvard had pulled himself back from more, remembering, maybe, the way Maklar had sometimes shied from his touch, afraid that he would push without even knowing he was doing so. Perhaps it is wise to take care, he said. Maklar turned his head, craning his neck back to look at Halvard, a question, maybe even a challenge in his eyes. You're being too wise. Fools together, remember? Halvard reached an arm around to trace one finger along that sharp jaw, down his throat, stopping just over his heart. You must tell me how to touch you, he said, his mouth at Maklar's ear. Maklar shifted against him, and maybe, Halvard thought, he could make him shiver. When the trees were bare, and the nights became cold, and the only birds to be seen were great flocks of geese flying south with voices like a crowd, Maklar left Halvard for his pilgrimage to Rivendell. Halvard had asked if he wished for his company, and Maklar did, but he could not say so. Instead, they bade each other farewell on the east road with an embrace, and the promise to meet again shortly after turning of the year. Maklar should have looked forward to the familiar solitude, should have found the silence comforting, but something had shifted, as if part of himself had been rattled loose and no longer fit back in its box properly. It made for a very long journey. At Ford, he heard the sound of a horse, and wondered which unlucky denizen of the last homely house had been sent out to escort him. It was a guard, whatever Edouard might call it, and Maklar wondered whether it was meant to protect the folk of Imladris from him, or to ensure his own safe arrival. Maklar greeted the horse first. Well met, Asvaloth, he said, rubbing her nose as she searched in his scarves for a treat. He had hidden an apple in his sleeves just for such a meeting. I did not think I would ever see the sons of Fëanor lowered to such bribery, said Glorfindel as Asvaloth crunched up the apple. You take a strange view of things if you think that bribery is our greatest sin. I don't know why, but I always expect for you to speak the old tongue. Glorfindel dismounted. He was very tall, and his hair shone like the light of the noonday sun, even though the dusk was falling fast. He laughed when Asvaloth blew apple-scented breath into Maklar's face and nudged his hat from his head. What use would it be to speak a tongue that few still use? I only speak my father's tongue when I visit the Lady of Lothlorien. He bent to pick up his hat and made a show of knocking the dust from it as Glorfindel laughed. I'm certain that you do. If you speak it in the manner of Fëanor when you come before the lady, then you may be braver than I had thought. I am honored that the mighty Balrog Slayer has given any thought at all to my bravery or lack thereof. Oh, come now, Maklar. There's no reason that we two should not be friends. There are few enough of our kindred here. He gently retrieved his scarf from Asvaloth's lips and summoned the tatters of his pride. I am fond of Asvaloth, and I am afraid that they will think of me discourteous, so I will only say that I will count it a success if I may one day learn to tolerate your presence. Friendship is perhaps too lofty a goal. With that, he shoved his hat back on his head and strode past Glorfindel. Are you coming or not? Glorfindel followed, laughing, of course, while Maklar wondered if slaying just one more kinsman would really make that much of a difference. End of chapter 8. Stay tuned.